guys, welcome back to another video. As you can see, I'm in my true crime corner, but today is not true crime. Today is a Wisconsin story that I thought I would talk about. I randomly talk about random Wisconsin things, whether it be graves, or a haunted bar, or the hodag. Today is about a fire that no one really talks about, so I thought, let's get into it. Everyone remembers the Great Chicago Fire. It happened from October 8th to October 10th, 1871. The fire killed approximately 300 people, destroying 3.3 square miles of city buildings, about 17,000 structures, leaving more than 100,000 people homeless. The fire began in a neighborhood southwest of the city center. A long period of hot, dry, windy conditions and the wooden construction of the buildings didn't really help with the fire not spreading. The fire leapt the south branch of the Chicago River and destroyed much of the central Chicago, and then leapt the main branch of the river, consuming the near north side. That fire was tremendously destructive. However, there was a fire that did so much worse that no one ever talks about. The city of Peshtigo is located on the banks of the Peshtigo River. The 93-mile-long river has plenty of rapids along its length, a plus for transporting large amounts of lumber from the North Woods downstream to Peshtigo with the river's current. Much of Wisconsin was covered numerous times by the Laurentide ice sheet, with the last glacial ice covering the area between 25,000 and 10,000 years ago. When the ice retreated northward, glacial sediment was deposited across the Midwest. This sediment contributed to the creation of productive soils across the region. Northern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan have predominantly acidic, sandy soils and are a favorite of pine trees. Specifically, the white pine tree grow readily in this soil and are very popular with logging. People flocked to the Midwest for new jobs, which the lumber industry provided. In 1870, Peshtigo's population was about 1,200 people, with an estimated 50 to 100 immigrants coming in by boat each week. It wasn't just loggers migrating to the area. Farmers often made their way to the Northwoods to clear a plot of land and make it their home. Many prospective farmers headed to the nearby area called Sugarbush, which was very close to Peshtigo, a series of settlements that took their name from the abundance of sugar maples in the area. Farmers commonly set fires to get rid of trees and stumps so they could clear fields, which is a practice that is sometimes still used today. It's to clear brush. It actually makes the soil more productive. Even the immigrants who came from Belgium, Norway, Sweden, Germany, they knew this is how you clear land. They saw fire as an ally. A few months leading to October, fires burned constantly, producing so much smoke that residents suffered from smoke-induced symptoms, including lethargy, fevers, hacking coughs, and something known as red eye. It was the amalgamation of these smaller fires, plus the drought that was happening at the time, and just the general atmosphere that really caused this to go out of proportion. On October 8th, the same day the Chicago fire started, a cold front moved in from the west, bringing strong winds that fanned these small fires into bigger fires and made everything go out of control. A firestorm ensued, and a wall of flames 3 miles wide and about half a mile tall was produced. That's some scary fucking shit. It began as a low rumbling noise, like the distant approach of a train. In the words of Denise Geis and William Lutz, who wrote A Firestorm at Peshtigo, says that a firestorm is superheated flames of at least 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, advance on winds of 110 miles per hour or stronger. The diameter of such a fire ranges from 1,000 to 10,000 feet. When a firestorm erupts in a forest, it is a blow-up, nature's nuclear explosion. Based on the vitrification of sand, the fire was estimated to have reached at least 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. It burned so intensely that it had created its own weather system, with winds whipping the fire into a tornado-like column of fire and cinders. A fucking fire tornado. Winds rushed through the town at more than 100 miles per hour. Escape routes were limited. Outrunning the fire was literally impossible. Some fled to the Peshtigo River, but the cold water created new problems for the residents. Peter Leshek, author of Ghosts of the Fireground and a firefighter, said in a 2002 interview with NPR that air temperatures were likely between 260 and 300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to literally combust hair. People taking refuge in the river had to repeatedly hold their breath and dunk their bodies in the water to not burn up. However, doing this could cause hypothermia, or they could have drowned. What we know of the fire is primarily taken from first-hand account of Reverend Peter Pernin. His account details a number of personal stories from people who were there the day this happened. Many of those personal stories are displayed alongside graves in the cemetery adjacent to the Peshtigo Fire Museum. One such story details the experience of the Kelly family. Terrence Kelly, his wife, and 4 children lived in the upper sugar bush. When the fire came with the terrible wind and smoke, the family became separated. Voices could not be heard above the roar of the fire. Mr. Kelly had a child in his arms, as did Miss Kelly. The other 2 children clung to each other. In search of safety, each group lost track of the others. The next day, Mr. Kelly and a child were found dead, nearly a mile from his farm. The mother and another child were safe. The other children, a boy and a girl, 5, were found sleeping in each other's arms near the farm. The house, barn, and all the outbuildings had burned to the ground. By the time it was over, due to decreased wind and rain that had finally arrived the next day, between 1.2 and 1.5 million acres of land had been burned, about the size of Connecticut. In addition to Peshtigo, 16 other communities were destroyed by the fire. The value of property and forest that was destroyed in the fire was estimated to be about $5 million, or $113 million today. Additionally, 2 million trees, saplings, and animals perished in this fire. Those who made it to the next morning found only a bleak, desolate prairie, the very location of the streets almost a matter of doubt. No vestige of human habitation remained, and the steaming, freezing, wretched group, crazed by their unutterable terror and despair, could but vaguely recognize one another in the murky light of day. Patches of sand were melted into glass. Railroad cars had been tossed off their tracks, and holes dotted the landscape where burned roots had turned to ash. The fire destroyed lines of communication out of Peshtigo. The nearest telegraph was in the city of Green Bay, about 45 miles to the south, so the surviving townspeople dispatched a boat to the city to get word of what the hell had just happened. As news of the fire was reported in the national and international press, donations of tools, bedding, clothing, and food poured in from around the world. No official death toll was determined after the fire. With so many dead and the weekly influx of newcomers, exact numbers could not really be ascertained, especially because all of the paperwork to tell people about how many people lived in town, in some of them, were burned, so there was no evidence of, population. In 1873, Colonel J.H. Leavenworth sent a report to the state government titled The Dead in the Burned District, detailing those who were killed in the Peshtigo fire. He compiled a list of those known to have perished and documented what he saw. Whole neighborhoods having been swept away without any warning, or leaving any trace, or record to tell the tale. The list of the dead can be depended upon as far as it goes, but it is well known that great numbers of people were burned, particularly in the village of Peshtigo, whose names have never been ascertained, and probably never will be, as many of these were transient persons at work in the extensive manufactories, and all fled before the horrible tempest of fire, many of them caught in its terrible embrace with no record of their fate except their charred and blackened bones. For the very sands in the street were vitrified, and metals were melted in localities that seem impossible. Estimates vary from 1,200 to 2,400 deaths, about 800 of those being from Peshtigo itself. More than 350 bodies were buried in a mass grave, primarily because so many had died that there was no one left to really tell who they were. 16 other communities, other than Peshtigo, burned to the ground. Many buildings were, some towns were completely non-existent. So entire families lived in these towns. And sometimes the entire family had died, so there was no one to claim the bodies. And sometimes they were so burned you couldn't tell if they were a woman, a man, or maybe even a child. That summer in 1871 was one of the driest on record. A 20th century reconstruction conducted by the National Weather Service showed that after a long period of higher than usual temperatures and drought, a low-pressure front with cooler temperatures produced winds across the region. This whipped the smaller fires into the giant firestorm. Everything was so dry that these little fires Once the wind hit them, they got bigger and burned the dead grass, and then it went to the trees, and then it just went everywhere. 100-mile-per-hour winds stoked the fire even more, with cool air fanning the flames and causing a gigantic column of hot air. This produced even more wind, a vicious cycle that turned a routine wildfire into an inferno. Peshtigo's logging industry was particularly to blame for the disaster. In an era before responsible forest management practices, loggers simply stripped the land without regard for potential fire hazards that they had caused. They dumped refuse from logging operations in large piles of tinder that became perfect fuel for the fire. And railroad operations cleared land using small fires, leaving piles of leftover wood behind them. The town itself was a tinderbox waiting to ignite. Most of its structures were made of wood, and as were its sidewalks, which were covered in wood chips. Everybody's heard about the Chicago fire, and that got all the publicity at the time. Peshtigo was a backwards lumber town then. Who had ever heard of it? Chicago was the big city. Which one was going to get more attention? The Reverend Peter Pernin, in his eyewitness account, states that the prolonged drought at the time, combined with the factor of human carelessness, were omens for the disaster. He also notes that the fires seemed to jump across the Peshtigo River using the bridges and upward air drafts to burn both sides. Other survivors reported the firestorm generated a fire whirl, described as a fire tornado, that threw rail cars and houses into the air. Many citizens escaped the flames by immersing themselves in the Peshtigo River, wells, or nearby bodies of water. Some drowned, while others succumbed to hypothermia. In one account, a man slit the throats of his children so they wouldn't have to succumb to an agonizing death. At the same time, another fire burned parts of the Door Peninsula. Because of the coincidence, some incorrectly believed that the Peshtigo fire had jumped across the waters of Green Bay into Door County. However, the fire did not jump across the bay. Most likely, the firestorm spread and created a new ground fire in New Franken, which then spread and burned everything northward up into Sturgeon Bay. There was also a fire in Michigan at the time that took a few communities as well. So there were technically like 3 or 4 fires happening at the exact, on the same day, which is kind of concerning. Following the fire, it took days for help to arrive. By the time that word got to Madison, most of the officials and their aid were going to Chicago, which was called the Great Fire. Food, clothing, and other aid were quickly sent in order to help survivors, many of whom went to Marionette. All that was left of the town of Peshtigo was a few buildings and ashes, with all personal items being destroyed. William Butler Ogden, a politician and lumber company owner, went to Peshtigo with the goal of rebuilding the town. It took years to rebuild, and many businesses never reopened. Specifically, the large wooden-ware factory that supplied jobs to many of the townsfolk was never rebuilt, leaving the town to never reestablish its logging business. Today, Peshtigo is a typical northeastern Wisconsin town and has roughly 3,500 residents. The Peshtigo Fire Museum, just west of U.S. Highway 41, has a small collection of fire artifacts, first-person accounts, and a graveyard dedicated to victims of the tragedy. A memorial commemorating the fire was dedicated on October 8, 2012. At the bridge over the Peshtigo River. They also have a website if you would like to see more stories and the history of this fire. The National Shrine of Our Lady of Good Help, a Marian shrine in Champion, has been established at the site of a chapel where, according to the shrine, Sister Adele Bryce and others sheltered from the fire and were miraculously passed over. According to Sister Adele, in October of 1859, she received a vision from the Blessed Virgin Mary with a warning, saying, "If they do not convert and do not pronounce, my son will be obliged to punish them." 12 years later, the fire erupted, and many people flocked to the church for safety. The people hoped and prayed, saying the rosary, and hours later, rain came, which destroyed the fire. Some of the only things that survived the Peshtigo fire were the convent, school, chapel, and 5 acres of land that was consecrated by the Virgin Mary. The only animals that survived the fire were those brought to the chapel. Following the fire, people had great faith in the chapel and the Virgin Mary, as they believed that she had saved them. In the following years, it has been said that miracles have occurred at the chapel. In one account, a blind girl went to the chapel to pray and came out with the ability to see. However, none of these have ever been properly recorded, probably because they're not true. Now, it is possible, and it is factual that the church did not burn in the fire. However, a girl going in there and then suddenly being able to see, I don't believe that for 1 minute. I believe that it was luck. Of course, religious people might believe it was the Virgin Mary saving those people. Maybe. But good for them. At least they made it out. Tornado Memorial County Park is located on the site of the former community of Williamsville, a small village in Door County, and is named for the fire whirl that occurred there. The park is the only thing left of the small town as the firestorm destroyed everything. Out of the 76 inhabitants of Williamsville, there were only 19 people who made it out alive. As a result of the fire, Williamsville was wiped off the map and was never rebuilt. The combination of wind, topography, and ignition sources that generated the firestorm at the boundary between human settlements and natural terrain is known as the Peshtigo paradigm. Those conditions were closely studied by the American and British military during World War II to learn how to create firestorms during bombing campaigns in cities in Germany and Japan. They actually made a demo first, a little-scale model of wooden buildings, and studied how you would drop bombs until it created a firestorm, something that devastating and that hot. Why the fuck would you want to create a firestorm? That's horrible! The event prompted almost no change in the practices of the lumber industry, which blows my fucking mind, or the way settlers approached life in forests. In the following decades, the rate of industrial logging increased, and the amount of fires increased with them. Wisconsin itself experiencing major fires in 1880, 1891, 1894, 1897, 1908, 1910, 1923, 1931, and 1936. Wisconsin, after this fire that killed probably up to 2,400 people, you just decided to keep doing it? You idiots. Now, the weird thing about the Peshtigo fire is it happened the same day as the Chicago fire, and there was also a fire in Michigan, and there might have been more. So the fact that all of these fires happened on the same day has confused people for many years. Many speculate, even since 1883, that a comet was the reason this happened. Many people believe that the fires in Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin were caused by the impact of fragments from Biela's comet. This hypothesis was revived in a 1985 book, reviewed in a 1997 documentary, and investigated in a 2004 paper published by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Certain behaviors of the Chicago and Peshtigo fires were cited to support the idea of an extraterrestrial cause, such as blue flames, thought to be cometary gases burning in the basements of houses. However, modern fire theory indicates that the blue color was most likely a product of burning carbon monoxide in the poorly ventilated basements of houses. Also, if a fire gets super hot, it can turn blue, Additionally, scientists with expertise in the field pointed out that there has never been a credible report of a fire being started by a meteorite landing. It breaks up in the atmosphere, hits the ground, fire! That's never been reported, so that'd be interesting, but there's no evidence that supports that. In any event, no external source of ignition was needed. It was kind of explanatory. There were already numerous small fires burning in the area as part of a land clearing operation, and similar activities after a tinder dry summer. You include drought, little small fires, and wind. It combines to make a firestorm. All that was necessary to trigger the firestorm, plus the other large fires in the Midwest, was a strong wind, which so happened to happen on October 8th. If you would like to learn more about this tragedy, there is a website, and if you go to Peshtigo, Wisconsin, they have a museum, and you can learn more then. This fire was tragic. It killed up to 2,400 people, destroyed 17 communities, and no one ever talks about it because it was in northern Wisconsin. They were all small towns, small logging towns. When Chicago lit a flame, everyone talked about it. Now, it killed 300 people. It destroyed a lot of Chicago. It was not a small fire. It was huge, and it caused a lot of damage. And people should be talking about it because it's a tragedy. 300 people died. However, on the same day, in another area, 2,400 people died. No one talks about it. I didn't even know about this fire until a few years ago. No one talks about it. No one. And I believe it should be discussed because this fire was horrible. These stories that I read about this fire, it made me so damn sad. especially the first-hand accounts where people were hiding in the rivers, and they had to keep dunking themselves, otherwise their hair would burn off, they would probably suffocate on fumes or light on fire, so they had to keep dipping. Either they drowned, hypothermia, they'd burned to death. A lot of bodies were burned to the point you couldn't tell if it was a woman or a man. Entire families were wiped out. They have a mass grave of 350 people that they could not identify because they were so burned up. They probably didn't even have all the pieces. And it's so freaking sad. No one talks about it. So I thought today I would share it with you because I think it's a story that everyone should know. And the sad thing about it is that more fires like this happen because nothing changed. However, a fire like this is very capable of happening again. If we have a drought, now of course, these techniques are still used today. They're not as common, but they are used in some areas. That helps the soil be more viable, and it removes brush, and it's easy. But if you combine that with the drought and wind, wildfires in California happen constantly. And a fire like this could very well happen again in Wisconsin. It all depends on the right circumstance. I hope to God something like this does not happen. Any fire in any state or anywhere is horrible. Wildfires cause a lot of damage. They make people homeless. They kill people. They just cause a lot of issues. And a fire like this, back then when you don't really have technology and there's no cars, like you can't get away. This fire is moving so fast there's no chance of escape. You either let it consume you or you try and hide in a river or a well or anything like that, but then you take the risk of your hair burning off, hypothermia, or drowning. You only really survived if you got lucky. That church got lucky. Whether it was Virgin Mary's intent or just a coincidence, I don't know. But what I do know is that this fire was a tragedy and deserves to be talked about. I hope you guys learned something today. If you would like to know more information, I linked the website down below. And if you're ever in Wisconsin, you could check out the Fire Museum in Peshtigo. Alright guys, I will see you Thursday with another True Crime Thursday and Monday with whatever I decide to post. Alright guys, I'll see you later.